The first time the black owl appeared, it was already watching the funeral. It sat on the church bell, motionless as a grave marker. And when the widow looked up, the bird turned its head and opened its beak as if whispering her husband's name. Then the coffin lid moved. No one screamed at first. The priest dropped his candle, and the flame rolled across the wet grass like a living eye. The widow backed away from the grave, clutching her throat, because from inside the coffin came 3 slow knocks, and then a sound like claws dragging wood from within. By dawn, the coffin was sealed again, but the priest refused to speak of what he had heard. He only crossed himself and warned the villagers not to answer any owl call after midnight. That night, every dog in the valley howled at once, and the black owl answered from the forest. Mara, the widow's youngest daughter, had never believed in omens. She climbed the hill behind the house with a lantern and a shotgun, determined to prove the bird was only an animal. But halfway up the path, she found feathers scattered in a perfect circle around a child's shoe she had buried years ago. The shoe belonged to her brother Tomas, who had vanished when they were children. Their mother had said he ran into the woods and never returned. But Mara remembered the night differently. She remembered her father digging in the garden, sweating in silence, while Tomas cried from somewhere beneath the floorboards. When Mara returned home, the house smelled of wet feathers and burned hair. Her mother sat at the table, staring at a black egg that had not been there before. It was warm. It pulsed once in her palm, and from inside came a tiny tapping, like a beak learning how to break free. Mara reached for the egg, but her mother slapped her hand away with surprising strength. Her eyes were red and wild. She whispered that the bird had returned because the debt was not paid. Before Mara could ask what debt, the windows burst inward, and something landed on the roof above them. The roof creaked under a slow, deliberate weight. Then came the scratching, not from claws, but from something sharper, as if the bird were riding with bone. Mara grabbed the egg and ran into the cellar, where her father's old tools hung in rows like instruments of punishment. In the cellar, she found a hidden door behind the coal bins. It had been nailed shut from the inside. Someone had scratched words into the wood so deeply that the grooves were still raw. Mara traced them with shaking fingers and read a single sentence. Do not let it remember the child. The black egg cracked in her hands. A wet, feathered beak pushed through the shell, followed by one blind eye, glossy as oil. Mara stumbled backward as the hatchling unfolded itself into a tiny owl, no bigger than her fist, and it spoke in her brother's voice, asking why she had buried him. She dropped the creature, and it struck the floor without a sound. Then it grew, not quickly, but in terrible pulses, each breath stretching its wings wider, each heartbeat adding another layer of black feathers until it stood as tall as a child, staring at her with human patience. Mara ran upstairs, but the hallway had changed. The portraits on the walls now showed only owls, one for each family member, their painted eyes following her. At the end of the corridor, her mother stood barefoot and silent, holding a shovel, and behind her the front door was already open. Outside, the yard was full of feathers. They covered the garden, the well, the fence, and the graves of the family dogs. Mara's mother began to dig beside the old apple tree, sobbing now, saying she had hoped the bird would stay buried with the truth. But the ground was already moving. A hand burst from the earth. Not a human hand, but a child's hand covered in black mud and feathers. Mara screamed and grabbed her mother, but the woman only whispered, "It found him first." Then the hand opened, and from the palm rose a second black owl, smaller, older, and far more angry. The two owls circled each other in the air, one young and one ancient, their wings cutting the night into pieces. Mara understood then that the bird was not one creature, but a lineage, a curse passed from body to body, and her family had fed it for generations. Her mother confessed in a broken voice that Mara's grandfather had made a bargain during the famine. He offered the firstborn child to the owl in exchange for harvest, health, and silence. But the owl had taken more than one child, and it never forgot a promise made in fear. Mara wanted to run, but the black owl landed on the roof beam above her and spoke again, this time in her father's voice. It said the debt was nearly complete. Then it turned its head toward the cellar door, where something was now knocking from the other side. The cellar door split open. Tomas stepped out, or what remained of him did. He was taller than Mara remembered, thin as a branch, with feathers stitched into his skin and eyes that reflected no light at all. He smiled at her with a mouth full of broken beaks. Mara's mother fell to her knees, weeping, and Tomas knelt beside her like a patient predator. He touched her forehead, and she went still, as if all her memories had been plucked out one by one. Then he looked at Mara and said he had been waiting for her to come home. He led Mara to the attic, where the walls were lined with nests made from hair, teeth, and wedding lace. In the center sat an old cradle. Inside it was a bundle wrapped in black cloth, and from beneath the cloth came the sound of a baby breathing in reverse. Tomas lifted the cloth. Beneath it was not a baby, but a skull the size of a fist, still warm, still alive, with feathers growing from the eye sockets. He said this was the first child the owl had taken, and that every generation had been feeding it pieces of the dead. Mara seized the skull and hurled it through the attic window. The glass shattered, and for one glorious second the owl screamed. The sound was so violent that the house shuddered, the portraits cracked, and every feather in the room rose into the air like a storm preparing to strike back. The scream ended abruptly. Silence fell so hard it felt physical. Then the black owl appeared in the window frame, larger now, its wings blotting out the moon. It stared at Mara with the calm of something that had already won, and behind it, the forest began to move. Trees bent toward the house as if listening. From the woods came the sound of dozens of tiny feet, then hundreds. Mara realized the owl was not alone. Every bird in the valley had come, black shapes lifting from branches, roofs, and graves, gathering for something ancient and hungry. Her mother suddenly remembered herself. She grabbed Mara's arm and shoved a rusted key into her hand, saying it opened the old root cellar beneath the well. There, she whispered, was the only thing the owl feared. But before Mara could ask what it was, Tomas seized her mother by the throat. Mara fled through the rain to the well, with the owl shrieking overhead and feathers sticking to her face like wet ash. The key fit a hidden lock beneath the stones. She climbed down into darkness, where the air smelled of earth, rust, and something far older than death. At the bottom, she found a room carved into the roots of the hill. In its center stood a mirror covered in salt and dried blood. When Mara wiped it clean, she did not see her own reflection. She saw every child her family had lost, standing behind her in the dark. The children in the mirror raised their hands and pointed upward. Mara understood. The owl had never wanted the living. It wanted witnesses. It wanted the family to remember what they had done. And now that she knew, the mirror began to crack from the inside. Above her, the house collapsed in a thunder of wood and wings. Mara climbed out into a storm of feathers and fire, carrying the cracked mirror like a shield. On the hill, the black owl waited with Tomas and her mother beside it, all three perfectly still, as if the final choice had arrived. Mara held the mirror toward the owl, and the reflected children surged forward like a flood of pale hands. The bird shrieked, split open, and from inside poured every stolen memory, every buried name, every voice her family had silenced. By sunrise, the owl was gone, but the hill was full of children calling her home.